Hi guys, Olive here today with the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. Just in case you don't know anything about Wishbone, I will tell you that it was a half-hour television program for children that always featured two different storylines. The first storyline was an adaptation of a work within the literary canon. So that could be a book, a play, a myth, a folktale, a short story, anything of that nature. And then the second storyline was always a real-life story of a family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier, and that real-life storyline always related back to the literary adaptation in some kind of way. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video, and I compare that episode against its source material. And then the fun part comes in. I start asking some questions. Was the episode faithful to the source material? What did they change, if anything, and why did they make those choices? Did they pull any kind of moral message out of the source material in order to communicate that to the young audience of this show? And finally, was it an entertaining episode of television? In today's video, we will be looking at a mid-season 1 episode of Wishbone that surprisingly takes on Molière's farcical play, The Imaginary Invalid. It's an episode titled The Canine Cure, and we'd better take a look before I become too ill to go on. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the start of this episode, Joe's friend Nathaniel has come to stay with him for the weekend. There's painting going on at Nathaniel's house, and he's allergic to paint fumes, hence why he can't stay at his house and has to come stay at Joe's. But apparently paint fumes aren't the only thing he's allergic to. He actually gives Joe's mom a whole list of his allergies. It seems like Joe, his mom, and even Wishbone, to be honest, all doubt that one kid could have that many allergies. And Wishbone uses that as an opportunity to introduce Molière's play, The Imaginary Invalid, which tells the story of a man who thinks he's much sicker than he actually is. It's a very meta introduction to this play, with Wishbone on stage, first playing Molière, introducing all the characters, and then revealing that he will be playing the role of the hypochondriac himself, Argon, who raises a stink about his pills and then demands to see his daughter, Angelique. Back in Texas, after Joe's mom sorts through all of Nathaniel's many medications, which includes a snakebite kit for some reason, Nathaniel explains to her that he had asthma when he was a very, very young child, and ever since, his mom worries a lot. Ellen explains that it's natural for parents to worry and want to care for their children, and sometimes kids even grow up to take care of their parents. Returning to the production of The Imaginary Invalid, Wishbone notes that it's Argon who wants his daughter to take care of him. He's run up quite the doctor's bill with his antics, and he wants his daughter to marry a doctor so he can continue getting his pills for hopefully a lower cost. His maid, Toinette, refuses to let him marry his daughter off to someone she doesn't love. At Joe's house, the boys are getting along swimmingly. 0 allergic reactions. But then Nathaniel's mother shows up with yet another list, and she almost jumps out of her shoes when she sees Wishbone. Apparently, even though it's not on his allergy list, Nathaniel is supposedly allergic to dogs, even though that's something he himself had no knowledge of. And even though he's been fine the whole time at Joe's house before his mother showed up, after his mother says he's allergic to dogs, Nathaniel starts sneezing, and poor Wishbone is put into quarantine for the rest of Nathaniel's visit. When David and Sam come over to visit, Joe explains that he wishes he could show Nathaniel that he may not be as sick as he seems, since he had no reaction to Wishbone before his mother showed up. Then we meet some new characters in the play. First, there's Argan's second wife, who pretends to be so devoted to her husband, but actually seems more interested in the money he'll be leaving her in his will. And Argan's brother makes an appearance as well, hilariously sending away all of Argan's doctors and insisting that he doesn't need them. He's perfectly healthy. He also pleads with Argan not to marry his daughter off to a man she can never love. And when Argan claims that his wife is more devoted to him than his daughter is, his brother devises a test. Pretend you're dead, and let's see everyone's true colors. Unsurprisingly, when everyone in the room thinks that Argan is dead, his supposedly devoted wife is glad that her husband has died, and she's finally exposed as the gold digger she truly is. Meanwhile, Argan's daughter is heartbroken by this news, and she no longer even wants to marry the man that she does truly love because she is so grief-stricken. This is how Argan knows who truly cares for him, and he changes his mind about forcing his daughter to marry. Wishbone devises a similar scheme back in Texas. He makes a prison break and heads straight up to Joe's room where the boys are staying overnight. He then proceeds to sleep in bed with Nathaniel lying right next to him the entire night long, and when Nathaniel wakes up feeling perfectly fine, actually completely healthy, no allergic reaction whatsoever, and Nathaniel realizes that he was sleeping next to a dog the whole night, he starts to realize that maybe he's not actually allergic to dogs. So let's talk about this episode. And my oh my, do we have some things to discuss about this one. But before I start to get into some of those dicier elements, I did just want to take a moment and say that this episode was fairly faithful to the play. There were definitely some watered down or abbreviated elements. For instance, Angelique, Argan's daughter, Angelique, her love interest was barely in this episode. Her sister wasn't in this episode at all, whereas in the play, she has a sister with a pretty significant role to play. Toinette, their maid, her impersonation of a doctor wasn't included in this episode, nor were Argan's threats to send Angelique to a convent if she didn't marry who he wanted her to marry. I understand why they left out that last part. That's horrifying and definitely not appropriate for children. But everything else that they left out of this episode was probably just because of time constraints. They normally don't have time to include everything from the source material. But that real life storyline, wow, that was something else. And it definitely hasn't aged as gracefully as a lot of other things on this show definitely have. We'll cushion it that way. I'll start off by saying that I see where they were trying to go with this moral message, because it is true that some illnesses can be psychosomatic. And it's also true that Nathaniel had absolutely no allergic reaction to Wishbone before his mother came over and put that idea into his head. So is it possible that was going on? Yes. But there are two main things I want to say about this real life storyline. The first thing centers around this idea that Nathaniel's mother can convince him he's allergic to something. I think that implies some very complex psychological things are potentially at play within this family. If Nathaniel is able to feel things because his mother says so, that implies a pattern. And I think it also hints that his mother might have some very deep trauma that she's still dealing with, because it seems like her son was extremely sick with asthma when he was a very young boy, and it seems like she's still maybe dealing with that. I think that whole family should be in therapy, basically. But the second thing I would like to say about this episode is actually probably the most important of the two things that I would like to say. Don't test allergies that way. And certainly don't show kids that testing allergies that way is okay. Nathaniel has a history of asthma. Whether or not the rest of it's real, we don't know. But asthma is a real thing in his past. Now, we're given the impression that he's more or less over it, but he still has a history of it. And if he was indeed allergic to dogs, he could have woken up in serious trouble. Jack Russell Terriers are not hypoallergenic. They actually have high levels of dander, as Wishbone jokes around about in this episode, but asthma is not a laughing matter. It may be a common ailment, especially in childhood, but that does not make it a joke. So I sort of get what they were trying to do with this episode, but those touchy elements I definitely didn't like, and I didn't like that there was kind of a lack of a moral message. If you look at it as a whole, I guess they're just saying don't always believe you're sick because maybe it's not true. But in a grander sense, it seems like the problem lies with Nathaniel's mother. And especially as a preteen, there's nothing you can really do if something like that's going on within your family structure. So what is this episode telling kids to do? What's the lesson that they're drawing from this? Don't believe your mom when she says you're sick? So unfortunately, I found this episode to be rather lopsided because I thought the play adaptation was fantastic. I especially loved that they showed it as a play in front of an audience. It definitely gave you a taste for what it would be like to see the play. And I think this episode definitely would inspire some people to read the play or go see the play. And as I always say in these What's the Story Wishbone episodes, I feel like that's part of the point of this show, is to give you the spirit of the source material and then inspire you to go and read or experience the whole thing on your own time. I thought the play adaptation was entertaining. I thought it was effective, very faithful to the source material. So that was wonderful. But then the real life storyline was just not good. And the moral message, if there even was one in there, it was very confused. But I think generally a moral message was just kind of absent from this episode, which is very unusual. They're normally trying to communicate something to the audience. So I'd say those two elements, the kind of conflicting nature of the two different storylines, add up to a below average rating for this one. So for better or for worse, those were my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone. I'd love to hear from you what you thought of this episode down in the comment section. You can put any other more general comments or questions down there as well. And if you would like to see more of these episodes of What's the Story Wishbone, where I break down the Wishbone episodes and compare them against their source material, if you have a favorite episode of Wishbone, you want to see if I've covered it, I'll link the playlist for you in the description box below that contains all the ones I've done previously and will contain all the ones I do later on down the line. And if you would like to connect with me personally, you want to see what I'm reading and writing about right now, you can find me on a variety of places around the internet, including Goodreads and Instagram, the two places where I'm the most active. The links to everywhere you can find me will be at the bottom of the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.